Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer lore. Today we will be talking about one of the gods of the Empire, Ar-Ulric, one of the old gods that was worshipped in the Empire long before it actually became the Empire. In fact, the Ar-Ulric, the high priest of the religion, can trace his lineage back a full 3,000 years, which means that the worship of Ulric was probably around a fairly solid 500 to 1,000 years before Sigeman. Unfortunately, the god of wolves and harsh winters was somewhat outdone by the far more glorious golden boy that was Sigeman. Generally speaking, you require a very specific type of population for them to embrace the god that tells you that you're going to be freezing to death in a cold winter while giant furry creatures chew your innards out, instead of the guy who tells you that you're going to go to heaven when you die. Luckily for Ulric, though, the lands of the Empire are not all wine, honey, and rivers of milk and chocolate or whatever other nasty substances you might want to swim in. It is in fact a rather horrible place, and it gets considerably more horrible the further north you get, which may perhaps explain why the worship of Ulric stands at its most powerful near the Grand Baronies of Nordland, Ostland, and of course in and around the Grand Duchy of Middenland. These provinces, being relatively close to the north, means that they do get their fair share of Chaos Raiders, considerably more than the softer southern provinces of the Empire. Granted, no province of the Empire is entirely safe, mind you. There's always going to be plenty of greenskins, bandits, and beastmen wandering through the forest, but the further up north you get, the odds increase rather exponentially that you'll be running into something far less natural. Something along the lines of a seven-headed chaos troll that has developed a particular inkling for female infants, for example, or a minotaur made entirely out of cast iron, or a dragon with two heads, except it doesn't actually have two heads, it just has one head and a neck that has been split in half by chaos mutations. Basically speaking, all manners of stuff that you really don't want to be running into on a dark forest trail. And with the situation being what it is not particularly surprising that the locals might decide that they need a little bit more of a hands-on type of god. And Ulric certainly fits that description rather well. Being a god of war, he primarily gets his power from good old-fashioned conflict. As such, his followers tend to be fairly boisterous people. Indeed, the White Wolves, a Templar order dedicated to the god Ulric, is essentially a bunch of crazy-ass red-headed barbarians that ride through the forest at high speed wielding massive two-handed hammers. This rather boisterous behaviour would certainly not be socially acceptable in the softer provinces of the Empire, but up north it is not only accepted, it's downright necessary. Remember, of course, that many of these provinces are not particularly wealthy, and many villages and homesteads rely upon foreign traders to bring in food, weapons, armor, supplies, and various other iron-working tools. Generally speaking, they will be trading food or locally made goods in return. Many of the more northern provinces make a living out of supplying the southern provinces of the Empire with high-quality timber, for example. And it would be no exaggeration to say that if these settlements were to be cut off from the various traders that not only bring them food and goods, but also take their own goods out to be sold in the wider empire, these settlements would almost certainly cease to exist. As such, it is obviously quite necessary to keep the roads open and, at least relatively, safe. This in and of itself, by the way, has spawned a rather interesting little trade. As previously mentioned, it is necessary to keep the roads open, e.g. free of beastmen, minotaurs, hydras, manticores, chimeras, griffins, all manners of horrible things that go bump in the night, and this has created a very odd little business. Many of the little communes around the place will send out hunting parties. Naturally, of course, it is the responsibility of the local lord primarily to keep the roads open. This is then further sent downwards, of course, to the local militias who will be carrying out patrols, occasionally helped out by the Knights of the White Wolf that enter into the forest to bash the shit out of random stuff that they can find, etc, etc. But, on many occasions, this will only extend to the road system system. For example, a troop of state militia might be occupied with patrolling a section of road from A to B, but everything outside of that road, they don't really care, they don't give a shit, it's not their job. This is a little bit of a problem for the locals, especially if they live off something like, woodwork, which necessitates people leaving the cozy relative safety of their homestead, palisaded homesteads, by the way. Any settlement in these areas that don't have walls are not going to be settlements for long. But regardless, they'd have to leave and actually go fetch the timber, which means that you now have a bunch of squishy-wishy and very, very tasty humans wandering through the forest. This can lead to some rather uncomfortable, encounters with the local wildlife. To prevent this, many villages organize bands of experienced hunters to go into the forest and try to, well, quite literally hunt down the creepy creatures. Now, obviously, there's a fairly hard limit on exactly what kind of shit these hunters can actually take on, but when it comes to dealing with roaming bands of greenskins, marauders, or beastmen, for example, most of the time their skill with a bow and knowledge of the area is enough to give them just enough of an advantage to kill the enemy without all getting murdered in return. And this is where that interesting little trade comes in. A fair few villages has actually started gathering up various hunting trophies and selling them. It might sound strange at first, but think of this. In the Imperium, being a noble knight is of course a very powerful and therefore a very coveted social status. However, to be a proper knight, you can't simply just be a noble. You're gonna have to have done something brave, something interesting, like, for example, killing a giant fuck-off miniature, or maybe having some beastman heads to your name. Now, not all nobles can be expected to wander out into the far deep dark north to go and kill these creatures, but they might have a bit of extra coin lying around. See where I'm getting at with this? Many of these villages would actually sell some of these hunting trophies to lazy fat nobles in the Empire so that they could point at them and go, yes, I totally killed this beastman, it was during the winter of blah 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 blah, etc. Now do bear in mind, this is in most cases a side business as best because, well, obviously, going out into the forest with the specific intent of finding things that are twice your size and very, very hungry might be a profitable business, but it's not one of those with a good solid pension plan. And granted, you might now be wondering what the hell does this have to do with Ulric, and, well, in all due fairness, absolutely fucking nothing, but I'm trying to give you a general indication of just how much life sucks in the northern provinces of the Imperium. Life is frequently short and always brutal. As such, it makes sense that they would worship Ulric, a warrior god, and certainly some of that inclination might simply be due to the fact that the warriors of the White Wolf are more likely to come wandering to settlements that they know to be worshipping their own patron deity, which, helps. Having the red-headed barbarians riding through your village every now and then is good for the economy, as you'll be selling the metric ass tons of bear, and secondly, they'll be bashing the shit out of any wandering beastmen warbands. But there's also several villages that simply believe because, well, that's all they have to believe in. The promise of an afterlife might be all well and good, but that doesn't really help you staying alive in the life you live at the moment. Ulric, however, promises to protect everyone by giving them the strength to protect themselves. Which is the classic kind of hogwash you hear from most religions. God helps those who help themselves, which basically means God is not going to lift a fucking finger to save your ass unless you do it yourself, which makes the whole granddaddy in the sky principle somewhat outdated, but details. But that's enough about the filthy peasants of the countryside. Nobody really gives a shit about whether or not they live or dies anyways. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the Ulric faith, because this is a little bit of an interesting thing. You see, Sigmar Unborogen, yes, that Sigmar, was a devout Ulrican faithful, going so far as to dedicate all of his victories to the god Ulric. This meant that Sigmar was the first emperor of the empire, obviously, but he was also the first Ulrican to be crowned emperor. In fact, it was to the Ar-Ulric of the time that he pledged his devotion both to the god Ulric and to the newborn empire. Obviously, Sigmar can't really pledge allegiance to, well, Sigmar, obviously, but still, it's a bit of an interesting situation, isn't it, when you have a deity that has pledged his allegiance to another deity. Granted, Sigmar had no idea he was going to be turned into a god, and in all due likelihood, he probably never wanted to be turned into a god. At the very least, there is nothing in Sigmar's backstory that suggests that he was aiming for divinity. Basically, Sigmar was in many cases just the Big E himself, the Emperor, except with way, way less clothing. This does, however, raise a rather interesting little question. If even Sigmar himself was a worshipper of Ulric, how the hell did the religion of Sigmar take a hold so completely and utterly in the Empire? I mean, you gotta remember, at this point, Ulric was pretty much the only major religion, and yet it has almost been entirely supplanted by the Sigmarite faith. Well, to explain that, you need look no further than good old-fashioned human greed and self-interest. The cult of Sigmar was originally founded by Johann Hellstrom, and it was a far more lenient religion than that of the good old-fashioned wolf god. While the wolf god, of course, claimed that everyone should be independent, every man is an island, all of that nonsense, and that they should only give their allegiance to the god Ulric, the Sigmarite faith was a little bit more lax. It granted far greater freedoms to the individual and didn't bind them by strict religious rules or mindset, and additionally, while the worship of Ulric was by necessity a very individualistic thing, with everyone being expected to care for themselves and their families, the Sigmarite religion was far more collectivist. It was more about the whole rather than the individual. It was more about the empire rather than the individual baronies. It was more about the emperor rather than the individual nobles, and was definitely a lot more about the individual nobles representing a greater whole than the individual peasant. Can you see where I'm going with this? Oh yes, indeed. The nobles quickly realized that with a faith that was primarily centered around the idea of centralizing power, of gathering everyone into one easy-to-manage command structure, then obviously the people at the top, the nobles, being the ones who represented this greater whole, would gain unimaginable amounts of power over the lesser classes. And suddenly it all makes sense. If everyone with real power in the Empire began backing this religion and building it up from the outside with money, with grants, with aid, building their churches, spreading their words, giving them access to technology like the printing press, for example, etc., etc., obviously, more and more people will be believing in this religion, simply because it is screamed out louder and it is supported more prominently. Additionally, to begin with, there were several benefits to being a Sigmarite. Many lesser nobles, in the quest to make the Sigmarite religion the dominant one, would levy all kinds of taxes and tariffs against followers of Ulric, using the fact that they had pronounced the cult of Sigmar as their state, quote-unquote, religion, to justify all manners of extra charges to be leveled against Ulrican followers. This, again, further increased the power of the cult of Sigmar. If you can only be rich by being a Sigmarite, then it's only a question of time until you denounce Ulric, isn't it? However, as previously mentioned, the faith of Ulric remained strong in the north. The cult of Sigmar was undeniably a bit softer than that of Ulric, and as previously mentioned, it was also quite collectivist, and that's all well and good in the densely populated southern provinces of the Empire, but in the north, where villages can be separated by many, many miles of hostile countryside, it is considerably harder to remain a collectivist society, seeing as you are entirely reliant upon your own skills, strength, and resources. You simply can't rely on the neighboring village sending food to you, for example, due to the simple fact that you never know whether or not the roads are going to be open to allow trade. They could be blocked by monsters, beastmen, chaos warriors, orcs, or any other manner of unpleasant creatures that take a strong dislike of any trade caravans, and this can happen pretty much without warning. The forests of the north are vast, deep, dark, and containing a whole lot of nasties, and you're never going to hunt down all of them. In fact, even just keeping them at bay is in most cases more than most villagers can actually manage. This in turn also means that the Ulrican faith has a fair bit of representation on the Elector Council. Not only can they count on the support of at least 2 elector counts, but the Ar-Ulric himself is also an elector in his own right. Now, granted, he does not wield the same political power as the Grand Theogonist of the cult of Sigmar, who wields not 1 but 3 votes, technically speaking, on the council, but nevertheless, being an elector count is a very powerful position, and being the leader of a religious order, being able to call upon the direct support of a further 3 elector counts means that the Ar-Ulric cannot be ignored at the negotiation table. And the Ar-Ulric is not only a force to be reckoned with when it comes to political power, but he also wields considerable military power, as has been talked about multiple times here. The Ulricans are rather warlike, and they command a strong position in the northern parts of the Empire, not only being able, of course, to draw from the military might of 3 elector counts, they also have considerable personal military might in the form of several Templar orders of knights and quite a few so-called Temple Guardians, especially in the city of Middenheim, what the Ulricans often refers to as the Faustschlag. And, by the way, now this is another example of Reichsspiel not being German, as of course in German the word for fist is Faust, whereas here it is Fausch. But in the end it means the same thing, fist strike. This refers to the act of God that created the cliff upon which Middenheim has now been constructed. Legend states that the entire mountain was once a gigantic edifice, just like the mountains of the World's Edge Mountains. However, Ulric smote the mountain and flattened it with a single strike of his mighty godlike fists, and ordained that the people of the Teutogens would build a mighty fortress upon its peak. And unsurprisingly, the soft, squishy humans, surrounded in every single direction by monsters, greenskins, beastmen, and chaos hordes, obliged. It should be noted, however, that while Middenheim is probably the closest thing the Ulrican faith has to a proper holy city, it is not entirely devoted to Ulric. Despite its nickname as the City of the White Wolf, it does have a fair bit of military doctrine that would not be accepted within the cult of Ulric. One of the teachings of the religious doctrine states that you should not use black powder weapons, crossbows, or helmets, but the state troops of Middenland use all 3 of these, and indeed, the city itself is defended by a great cannon, so massive that it requires an enslaved giant to reload the weapon. Oh, and by the way, it should probably also be mentioned that the cult of Ulric is not as united as they would like to have you believe. Just like the Sigmarite cult has several undercults, sects, and subsections of their religion as a whole, the Ulrican faith are also rather divided. In fact, there is a subset that call themselves the Sons of Ulric, that consider themselves to be the direct descendants of Ulric himself. They have a considerably more hardline stance against the rest of the Empire than the cult as a whole. The Sons of Ulric believe that only the worship of Ulric should be legal in the northern provinces of the Empire, and that the worship of Sigmar should be entirely outlawed. They have also, on several occasions, championed the cause of, shall we say, independence? Although I suppose that's not entirely the correct word. Essentially, the Sons of Ulric want complete control over the religion as a whole. They are of the opinion that they should control the direction in which the worship of Ulric is taken, rather than the Ar-Ulric, who they consider to be a mere puppet of the Elector Count of Middenheim. They also wish to create an entirely different empire within the empire, with, of course, the religion being primarily based around the worship of Ulric and various other laws to be passed. For example, they don't actually want to be a part of the empire at all as a whole. They still wish to maintain the political and, perhaps more importantly, military ties to the rest of the empire, because otherwise the North would be somewhat vulnerable, but they don't want to be doing silly things like worshipping Sigmar or paying taxes. It's kind of the definition of having your cake and eating it too, isn't it? There's also several less confrontational groups. Everyone knows, of course, of the Knights of the White Wolf, but they're also such as the Order of the Winter Throne, that believes that a time will come known as the Evernacht, a time where Ulric finally destroys all of his enemies in one great cataclysmic battle, and ushers in an era of eternal winter. Now, I'm interested in hearing how the Order of the Winter Throne suggests that they're going to be living through an era of eternal winter and darkness, but, oh well, details. And as might be expected, these various sub-cults have their own way of interpreting the religion as a whole. Some of them are even so decadent as to allow the use of helmets. Pah! That's almost as bad as letting the peasants vote. Ugh. But of course, at the end of the day, they are all worshippers of Ulric, and will all, more or less, answer the call of their god. Remember also that this is of course the Warhammer universe, a universe in which magic not only exists, but takes on a very easy to understand and surprisingly logical form. This also allows the worshippers of Ulric to bring about miracles and magic that's spawned, obviously, from their gods, or at least so they like to tell themselves. As such, even if the position of the Ar-Ulric as the primary leader of the religion may occasionally be questioned, his authority is not up for debate, since it stems directly from Ulric itself. Even the sons of Ulric believe that the Ar-Ulric is misinterpreting rather than not receiving instructions from their gods, a rather important difference. And with that, I'll wrap up this video about the Ulrican faith. I will have to do one about Sigmar at some point, but I'm too lazy. I'm sure I'll get around to it sometime. Probably even this year. Who knows? Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.